She gave that house everything, 31 years, every Saturday morning, every broken pipe fixed on a pension budget, every tax bill stretched across sleepless nights, and on a Tuesday morning in October, a county officer she had never met in her life read her name off a clipboard and told her to step off her own porch. Delinquent property taxes. Final notice expired, property repossessed. He didn't look up once. 2 suitcases sat at her feet, 31 years, reduced to 2 suitcases. Across the street, a neighbor watched the whole thing happen and closed the blinds. Nobody came out, nobody said her name. At 75 years old, Martha Jean Carter was being cleared out of the way like furniture nobody wanted anymore. If you have ever worked your entire life for something, and watched it disappear while the people around you looked the other way, this story is going to hit you somewhere deep. Because 3 weeks after that porch, Martha crawled through a door in an abandoned house that nobody had touched in 40 years. Her parents had walked away from it without explanation, without looking back, and they had left one rule, one single rule. That basement stays closed. Martha had obeyed that rule her entire life, until the morning she had nothing left to lose. What she found down there was not money. It was not jewelry. It was something that certain people in that town had spent 4 decades hoping would never be found. If this is the kind of story that deserves to be told, hit subscribe right now. Because Martha's father spent his entire life trying to protect something important, and then had to walk away before he could finish it for 40 years. Nobody knew. Nobody looked. Martha is about to change that, and you do not want to miss the moment she does. Stay with me. Because what happens next is the kind of thing that makes you realize some people are not finished. They are just getting started. Some mornings stay with you forever. Not because something extraordinary happened, but because something ordinary was taken. Martha Jean Carter picked up those 2 suitcases at 9:47 inches the morning. And in that single motion, 31 years became the past. The county officer was already back in his car, engine running, ready for his next stop. Because to him, this was Tuesday. To Martha, it was the end of something she had spent her entire adult life building quietly and carefully. One payment at a time. Nobody from the neighborhood came outside. A dog barked somewhere down the street. A sprinkler ran in somebody's yard like nothing had changed. And Martha stood on that sidewalk with 2 suitcases and the particular kind of loneliness that only comes when you realize the world has already moved on. Before you even had a chance to catch your breath, she had painted that porch railing herself. April of 1993. Her husband had just come home from his first hospital stay, and she hadn't wanted him worrying about the house while he was trying to get his strength back. So she bought the paint, mixed it herself to get the exact shade of white she wanted, and spent an entire Saturday making sure every inch was covered. That was who Martha was, the kind of woman who handles things quietly, so the people she loves don't have to. She turned left on the sidewalk and started walking. She didn't look back, not because she wasn't heartbroken, but because she had learned a long time ago that grief without direction just becomes weight, and she was already carrying enough. The motel was 12 blocks away. She had paid for 3 nights in advance. After that, she had $86 left to her name. Not enough for a 4th night. Not enough for a security deposit anywhere. Barely enough to keep herself fed while she figured out what came next. She ran the numbers in her head the way she always did. Carefully, honestly, without flinching. And every way she ran them, they came out the same. She had one option left. Just one. And it was the option she had spent 40 years, hoping she would never have to consider. There was a folder sitting at the bottom of her larger suitcase, beneath her mother's quilt. She hadn't opened it in over a decade, but she knew exactly what was inside. A deed. A property outside of town that had been sitting untouched since the night her parents left it, and never went back. She had never understood why they left the way they did. Fast. Final. Without explanation. And she had especially never understood the one rule they left behind. The rule nobody in the family ever questioned. That basement stays closed. She had respected that rule her entire life. Never asked why. Never pushed. But tonight, sitting alone in a motel room with $86 and no plan, for the first time in 40 years, she was starting to wonder what exactly they had been so afraid of. Martha Jean Carter was not a woman who collapsed, not when Raymond died, not when Calvin stopped calling, not when they handed her a certificate after 23 years and showed her to the door. She was the kind of woman who absorbed things, quietly, without scene, without asking anyone to witness it. And that is exactly how the worst kind of loss works. It doesn't arrive with sirens or gathering crowds. It arrives in complete silence, one door closing at a time. Raymond went first, not suddenly, not dramatically. He went the way he lived, quietly, and without burdening anyone more than he had to. He had been folding his medical paperwork into his bedside drawer for months before Martha found it. He hadn't wanted her to worry. She hadn't wanted him to see her worry either, so they had both been carrying the same fear, in separate silences, under the same roof. When he passed on a Tuesday in February, soft snow outside, Martha did not fall apart at the funeral. She made sure everyone had somewhere to sit. She refilled the coffee. She thanked people for coming with a steadiness in her voice that made grown men look at their shoes. And when the last car pulled out of the driveway that evening, she sat down at the kitchen table and didn't move until the sun came up. She never described that night to anyone. Some things don't have words. They just have weight. Her son Calvin called twice in the weeks that followed, then once a month, then holidays only. Then an argument arrived, the kind that happens between two people who are both too proud and too wounded to say the true thing out loud. After that, the calls stopped almost entirely. Martha never told anyone what that argument was about. She just added it to everything else she was carrying and kept moving. Then the budget cuts came. 23 years as a county records clerk. She knew those filing systems the way some people know scripture, which land records had gaps, which ownership filings didn't quite line up if you looked carefully enough, which names appeared on documents that probably shouldn't have been there. She had spent 2 decades being the person who kept the details straight. They let her go with a certificate of appreciation and a card signed by people who had misspelled her name in 4 different ways. Part-time work followed, then medical bills. Then the property taxes began climbing faster than anything she could do to stop them, and through every single bit of it, Martha adjusted, without complaint, without asking for help, the way she always had. But here's what nobody understood about a woman like Martha. All those years working with land records, all those files she had quietly cross-referenced and carefully studied, had given her something most people never develop. The ability to recognize when something important has been deliberately left out. And somewhere in that abandoned house outside of town, her father had left something out, something buried beneath a concrete floor, something padlocked shut, not to hide it from the world forever, but because he ran out of time before he could finish what he started. And Martha, whether she was ready or not, was the only person left alive who might understand what it meant. The motel room was the kind of place that had seen better days and stopped apologizing for it. Thin curtains that didn't quite meet in the middle, a heater that clicked 3 times before it decided whether to work, a bathroom mirror with a crack running diagonally across the left corner, like it too had taken a hit it never fully recovered from. Martha set her 2 suitcases against the wall, sat on the edge of the bed, and did what she had always done when the ground shifted beneath her. She got practical. She opened her purse and laid everything out on the bedside table, methodically, the way she used to organize case files at the county office, 1 pile for what she had, 1 pile for what she owed, and the brutal, unblinking space in between for what she needed to figure out. $86. She counted it twice. Not because she thought she had miscounted the first time, but because she was hoping she had. She hadn't. 3 nights in this motel had already been paid for. After the 3rd night, there was no 4th, no security deposit for an apartment, no cushion for groceries beyond the next few days, no room for a single unexpected expense. She had navigated tight before, but tight had always meant cutting back. This was different. This was the kind of stillness that comes when every door has finally closed and the hallway itself has run out. She picked up her phone, scrolled to Calvin's name, held it there for a long moment, long enough to imagine the conversation, long enough to hear his voice in her head before he even picked up that particular careful tone he used when he was trying to be helpful, while also keeping his distance. She put the phone back down. Some doors you don't open when you are already this close to the edge, not because you don't love the person on the other side, but because you know that asking might cost more than you have left to give. She sat with that for a while. The heater clicked, then hummed, then settled. Outside, a truck passed through the lot and was gone. Martha reached down to the larger suitcase, unzipped the front compartment, moved aside her mother's folded quilt, and pulled out the manila folder. She set it on the bed beside her, didn't open it, just looked at it. The folder was old enough that the edges had gone soft. Her name was written across the top in her father's handwriting. Not her married name, her given name. The name he had called her when she was small enough to sit on his knee while he worked at the kitchen table, surrounded by papers and maps she had never been allowed to touch. She remembered asking him once what all those papers were for. He had smiled without looking up. Just keeping things honest, he had said. Somebody has to. She hadn't understood what that meant at 7 years old. She wasn't entirely sure she understood it now, but she opened the folder. And there it was, the deed to the property outside of town. Her name on it, clear as anything. Below the deed, a single index card in her father's handwriting, an address, and 3 words beneath it that made her breath go shallow. Don't wait long. She read it again, then once more. 3 words written by a man who had been gone for over 20 years. And he somehow landing in this cracked mirror motel room, on the one night she had absolutely nowhere else to turn. She closed the folder, looked at the ceiling for a long moment, then she looked at the suitcases against the wall, and for the first time since that Tuesday morning on the porch, Martha Jean Carter made a decision, not from hope, not from courage, from something quieter and more durable than both. She was going to that house, not tomorrow, first light. She left before the motel parking lot had a single other car moving. No coffee, no breakfast, just the 2 suitcases, the folder tucked under her arm, and the particular kind of quiet that only exists in the world before most people have decided to join it. The address on that index card was not far, but it felt far, the kind of distance that has nothing to do with miles. She had not been on this road in decades, and the town she drove through in the gray early light was not quite the town she remembered. New buildings where old ones used to stand, empty lots where businesses once ran, a gas station that still had the same sign from 30 years ago, but different people behind the glass. Progress had moved through here, the way it always does, selectively, taking what it wanted, and leaving the rest to figure things out on its own. The house appeared before she was ready for it. She almost drove past, because the trees had grown in so completely around it that the structure had quietly disappeared into the landscape. Not absorbed, not reclaimed, simply forgotten by everything that had moved on without it. She pulled off the road, sat in the car for a moment, just looked. The porch was still standing, the roof had held, the front door was closed, the way someone closes a door when they intend to come back. That detail stayed with her. Closed, not broken open, not hanging, closed, like whoever had walked out of it last had believed, even in that final moment, that the leaving was temporary. She got out of the car. The morning air was cold and sharp and smelled like earth after rain. Her shoes found the path through the overgrown grass, the way feet sometimes remember what the mind has tried to forget. She pushed the front door open. It gave without much resistance, and what waited inside stopped her at the threshold. It was not ruin. That was the thing that caught her completely off guard. It was interruption. A coffee cup still sitting on the kitchen counter, a cardigan draped over the back of a chair like someone had just stepped out of it. A stack of papers on the small desk in the corner, held down by a smooth, flat stone, the kind her father used to pick up on walks and carry home for no particular reason. Everything exactly where it had been left. 30 years of dust settled gently over a life that had simply stopped mid-sentence. Martha moved through the rooms, taking it in, letting the stillness speak, not yet ready to disturb it, just trying to understand what kind of leaves a coffee cup on the counter. What kind of urgency doesn't allow for even that? She had always believed her parents left this house because they were ready to. Standing in it now, she was no longer sure of that. Because people who leave on their own terms take the cardigan, they take the cup. They don't leave a life sitting exactly where they dropped it, as if they planned to be back by noon. Martha moved toward the hallway, and then she saw it, at the end of the hall, the basement door. Same latch, same weight to it. She could feel that just from looking. And around it, the same silence she remembered from childhood, the kind of silence that isn't empty, the kind that is, full of something that has been waiting a very long time to be heard. She did not move toward it, not yet, because somewhere beneath the dust and the stillness and the cardigan on the chair, something else had caught her eye. On the desk, under the flat stone, the papers her father had left behind were not blank. The papers were not random. That was the first thing Martha understood, standing at that desk with the flat stone still in her hand. Her father had not left behind a scattered pile of old documents. He had left behind an organized one, each sheet placed deliberately, each page facing the same direction, the kind of careful arrangement that doesn't happen by accident and doesn't happen in a hurry. Except he had left in a hurry. That contradiction settled into Martha's chest like a stone dropping into still water. He had taken time to organize these papers in the middle of whatever had made him leave so fast he couldn't take the cardigan off the chair. She set the flat stone down carefully and began to read. The first page was a land survey, hand-drawn, precise, with boundary lines marked in her father's careful print and notations in the margins that she couldn't fully make out yet. The second page was a letter, addressed to no one in particular, signed by her father, dated 3 weeks before the night they left. She didn't read it fully, not yet, because something else was pulling at her attention. At the bottom of the stack, partially visible beneath the last few sheets, was a name, a family name she recognized, not from childhood, from her years at the county records office, a name that had appeared on property filings, more than it should have, more than made sense, if you knew what to look for. Martha set the papers down, stood very still for a moment, then she looked down the hallway. At the basement door, she had been avoiding it since she walked in, not from fear exactly. From the particular reluctance that comes when you already sense that what waits on the other side of a door is going to change the shape of everything you thought you understood. She walked toward it slowly. The hallway felt longer than it looked. Her hand found the latch, cold metal. Familiar weight. She pulled. The door resisted. The wood had swollen over decades of temperature and neglect, sealing itself shut the way old things do when they have been left alone long enough. She pulled again, harder, and on the third attempt, with her shoulder against the frame for leverage, the door gave. A breath of cold air moved past her, the smell of old paper, concrete, something faintly metallic she couldn't name. She found the light switch on the wall just inside. Clicked it once, nothing. Clicked it again. A single bulb at the far end of the basement flickered twice, then held. And in that unsteady yellow light, Martha saw what her father had spent years quietly building, not treasure, not anything that glittered, floor to ceiling along the left wall, wooden shelves her father had built himself. She could tell by the joints, the same way he built the bookcase in their old living room. Same spacing between the planks, same small notch cut into the corner of each shelf so they could be leveled on an uneven floor. Those shelves were filled with boxes, dozens of them, each one labeled in her father's handwriting, dates, family names, property locations. Martha stepped down onto the concrete floor, pulled the closest box toward her, lifted the lid. Inside, neatly organized despite the years, were documents, land agreements, some boundary maps, signed letters between families, records of transactions that had never, as far as Martha could tell, been officially filed anywhere. She lifted one document carefully, read the first paragraph, then stopped. Because the family name at the top of that document was the same name she had just seen on the papers upstairs, and written in the margin, in her father's handwriting, were 4 words that made the basement feel suddenly smaller. They know we have this. 4 words. That was all it took. They know we have this. Martha read them again, then again, standing in that basement under a single flickering bulb, holding a document that had been waiting in the dark for 40 years. She set it down carefully, the way you set down something that has just changed the weight of everything around it. She pulled the next box forward, then another. Not frantically, not with shaking hands or racing breath, the way she had always approached things that mattered most, methodically, carefully, the way her father had taught her without ever meaning to. The letters came first, 6 of them, tied together with a piece of kitchen string that had gone brittle with age, each one addressed to her father by name. The first 2 were civil, formal language, careful phrasing, the kind of words people use when they want to apply pressure without leaving fingerprints on it. The third letter was less careful. It suggested that certain records were better left where they were, that some boundary disputes had already been settled to everyone's satisfaction, that continuing to ask questions about land that had already changed hands served no one's interest. No one's interest. Martha read that line 3 times because she had spent 23 years in a county records office, and she knew exactly what that phrase meant when someone put it in writing. It meant their interest. It meant stop. The 4th letter had no formal language left in it at all, just a single paragraph, plain words, direct, the kind that don't need a lawyer to interpret. Her father had been told, in terms that left nothing unclear, that what he was doing had been noticed, and that noticed was not a comfortable thing to be. Martha set the letters down, sat on the bottom step of the basement stairs, and for the first time since she had walked through that front door, she let herself be still, not defeated. Still. The kind of stillness that comes when pieces you have been carrying separately suddenly show you how they fit together. Her father had not been a complicated man. He had been a precise one. He believed that records existed for a reason, that land boundaries mattered, that families deserved to know what was legally theirs, and somewhere along the way, he had discovered that certain records in this county had been arranged to benefit people who were never meant to benefit from them, families displaced quietly, boundaries redrawn on paper, while the people living on that land had no idea what was happening beneath their feet. Her father had started correcting it, outside official channels, without authority, without protection, just a man with a kitchen table and the belief that somebody had to keep things honest. And when the pressure came, he made the only decision he could make to protect what mattered most. He closed the basement, walked away from the house, and never told his daughter why. Not because he didn't trust her. Martha understood that now, with a clarity that settled through her like cold water finding level. He hadn't told her, because telling her would have made her a target too. He had carried it alone, the way she had always carried things alone, the way, she now understood, she had learned directly from him. She stood up slowly, and looked at the shelves, at the boxes, at 40 years of unfinished truth, stacked and labeled and waiting. He hadn't failed. He had been stopped, and there was a significant difference between those 2 things that Martha felt settle into her bones like something finally making sense. She picked up the document with the 4 words in the margin. Read them one final time. They know we have this. Then she looked around the basement at everything her father had built and gathered and protected at great personal cost, and thought quietly to herself, they don't know I have it now. She didn't take everything. That was the first decision she made, standing at the bottom of those basement stairs, in the gray morning light filtering down from above. Taking everything would be overwhelming. Taking everything would be the kind of move that gets dismissed before anyone looks closely enough to see what is actually there. She knew that from 23 years behind a county records desk. When someone walks in carrying too much, the instinct of every clerk in every office is to find a reason to send them away. So Martha took one file. Just one. She chose it carefully, Not the most dramatic one, not the one with the 4 words in the margin, not the letters with their thinly veiled warnings. She chose the one that was cleanest, the one with the clearest documentation, the most legible handwriting, the most verifiable names and dates, the one that didn't need her to explain everything first before it could speak for itself. She tucked it under her arm, walked back up the basement stairs, pulled the door closed behind her, and stood in the hallway for a moment in the particular quiet of a house that had just given up one of its secrets and was deciding whether it regretted it. The county office opened at 8:30. Martha was there at 8:22. She sat in a plastic chair by the door with the file on her lap and her hands folded over it. The way you hold something you have decided to trust the world with, even though the world has not recently given you reason to. When the doors opened, she walked to the first available desk. A young clerk, early 30s, the efficient kind, who had learned to process people quickly because the line behind them never got shorter. Martha placed the file on the desk, explained briefly what it was, where it came from, what it appeared to document. The clerk listened with the particular expression of someone being professionally patient while privately calculating how quickly this could be resolved and moved along. Outdated records, she was told, difficult to verify, the kind of claim that would require significant documentation before anyone could look into it seriously. Martha nodded. She had expected that. She had sat on that side of the desk herself for over 2 decades. She knew exactly how the first response always sounded. So she didn't argue. She simply asked if the clerk would look at page 3. Just page 3. The clerk looked. Something shifted in the room, not dramatically, not the kind of shift that fills a room with noise and movement, the quiet kind, the kind that happens when someone trained to recognize inconsistencies encounters one they cannot immediately explain away. The clerk looked up, asked one question. Martha answered it. The clerk looked back down at the page, then did something Martha had not expected, picked up the phone, not to send her away, not to call security, not to refer her somewhere else with a printed form and a polite dismissal, to call someone specific, someone whose name Martha didn't catch, but whose title she recognized immediately. Senior Records Examiner. Martha sat back in her chair, kept her hands folded, kept her expression steady, the way she had always held herself when something important was finally and beginning to move. Outside the window, the morning had fully arrived, and for the first time in longer than she could easily measure, Martha Jean Carter was exactly where she needed to be, doing exactly what she had spent a lifetime, without knowing it, preparing for. Truth is a strange thing. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't arrive with fanfare or formal apology. It moves the way water moves through old stone, slowly, quietly, and with a patience that outlasts everything built to contain it. The first family came on a Wednesday morning. Martha hadn't expected them. She had simply left word with the clerk, the one who had made the phone call, that if anyone had questions about the documents, they could find her at the house outside of town. She hadn't expected anyone to actually come, but there they were. A woman named Bertrice Elam, 61 years old, standing at the front door of a house that looked like it had no business receiving visitors, holding a photograph so old the edges had gone amber. She didn't say much at first, just held out the photograph. It was a picture of a plot of land, a small house on it, a family standing in front, her grandparents. The land had been in her family for 3 generations, until a boundary dispute in 1979 had quietly swallowed it whole. Nobody had been able to prove anything. Nobody had been able to find the original documentation. Until now. Martha spread 3 folders across the kitchen table. Her hands moved the way they used to move at the county office, with the careful, deliberate confidence of someone who had spent decades knowing exactly where things belonged. She found the relevant survey maps, the original boundary markers, a signed agreement between 2 families that had never been formally filed, but had been witnessed and dated and preserved in her father's careful handwriting. But Bertrice Elam sat across that kitchen table, and for a long moment she didn't speak. Then she pressed both hands flat against the table, the way people do when they need something solid beneath them, and said, "He knew. Your father knew exactly what they did to us." Martha didn't answer right away, because she was beginning to understand something important. Her father hadn't simply been tracking inconsistencies. He had been building a record, case by case, family by family. A quiet, deliberate archive of every boundary pushed, every agreement ignored, every name removed from documentation it should have stayed on. He had known these families. He had sat with them, listened to them, and then he had written everything down, with the precision of someone who understood that truth without documentation is just a story. And stories can be dismissed. Documentation cannot. Word moved slowly after that, the way word moves in small communities, person to person, carefully, with the particular caution of people who have been disappointed before. A second family came the following week, then a third. A local legal aid group heard what was happening and sent a representative, a quiet, methodical woman named Adez Okafor, who sat with Martha for 3 hours going through files and left with photocopies and a list of names that needed immediate follow-up. 2 volunteers arrived the week after that, college students from the County Historical Society. They brought acid-free storage boxes and archival gloves and treated those documents with a reverence that made Martha's chest tighten in a way she hadn't expected. Because they understood what she was only beginning to fully grasp. These weren't just her father's papers, they were people's lives, documented, preserved, and finally moving toward the light. But as the kitchen filled with quiet, focused activity, and as Martha watched strangers carefully handle documents her father had died protecting, a question settled over her that she couldn't shake. If her father had built all of this, and had been forced to walk away before finishing it, then someone had made sure he walked away, and that someone may not have been aware that his work had just been found. There is a particular kind of invisibility that comes with age. It doesn't happen all at once. It creeps in gradually, the way a draft creeps under a door in winter. First, people stop asking your opinion. Then, they stop making eye contact when they talk to you. Then, they start talking around you, as if you are furniture that can hear, but doesn't need to be addressed directly. Martha had been living inside that invisibility for years. She had felt it at the grocery store, at the pharmacy counter, in the waiting rooms of offices where young clerks looked through her to the person standing behind her. She had learned to move through it quietly, the way you learn to move through any weather that you cannot change. But something was shifting now, and it wasn't subtle. The kitchen table that had once held nothing but an old folder and a deed now held organized stacks of documents sorted by decade, flagged with handwritten notes, cross-referenced against county maps pinned carefully to the wall beside the window. People came through that door now, not to offer pity, not to process her as a case number or a problem to be managed. They came because she had something they needed: knowledge, precision, a memory that had been sharpened by decades of handling exactly this kind of documentation. Adez Okafor from the legal aid group had started calling her twice a week, not to check on her, to consult her. There was a difference, and Martha felt that difference in her bones. A county historian named Ptolemy Wash arrived on a Thursday afternoon, carrying a leather satchel and a quiet intensity that reminded Martha of her father. He had been researching land displacement patterns in the region for 11 years. 11 years. And in 3 conversations with Martha, he told her she had filled in gaps he had spent a decade trying to locate. She hadn't gone looking for significance. She had simply done what she had always done, paid attention, kept things straight, trusted the details when everything else felt uncertain. And now those details were mattering to people in ways she hadn't imagined when she crawled through that basement door. One afternoon, a young woman sat across from Martha at the kitchen table, early 20s, a notebook open in front of her. She had driven 2 hours to ask Martha about a specific set of documents tied to her great-grandmother's land. At the end of the conversation, she closed her notebook, looked at Martha directly, and said, "I grew up being told that land was just gone, that there was nothing left to find. Nobody told me someone had been keeping records all along." Martha didn't respond immediately. She looked at the stack of folders between them, then at the county maps on the wall, then at her own hands resting on the table. These hands had painted a porch railing alone on an April morning, had counted $86 on a motel bedside table, had crawled through a basement door that hadn't been opened in 40 years. And now, they were handing people back something they thought was gone forever. She wasn't being processed anymore. She wasn't being looked through. She was being looked at. Fully. Finally. But even as that recognition settled around her like something long overdue, Martha's mind kept returning to the same unresolved question, the one that had been sitting quietly beneath all the activity, waiting for her to stop moving long enough to face it. Her father had not worked alone. The volume of documentation in that basement, the cross-referencing, the organized correspondence between families, was not the work of one man sitting alone at a kitchen table. Someone had helped him, someone who understood the system well enough to know exactly what to preserve and what would be needed to make it matter decades later. And that person had never once come forward. Martha had never been the kind of woman who waited to be saved, not once in 75 years. She had saved herself quietly, in 100 small ways, that nobody ever saw or counted. So when the support began arriving, she almost didn't know how to receive it. It didn't come dramatically. No single moment where someone handed her a check and told her everything was going to be fine. No press conference, no ceremony. It came the way most real help comes, incrementally, imperfectly, and from directions she hadn't anticipated. The County Historical Preservation Office made the first move. After Ptolemy Wash submitted his formal assessment of the documents, a small initiative was approved to preserve and catalog the entire basement archive. It wasn't a large budget, but it was enough to bring in proper archival equipment, trained personnel, and most importantly, legitimacy. The documents were no longer just an old woman's discovery in an abandoned house. They were now officially part of the historical record, and that changed everything about how people treated them. The legal aid group moved next. Adiza Okafor had been quietly building cases from the documentation for weeks. 3 families had valid claims strong enough to pursue formally. 2 boundary disputes that had been considered permanently closed were reopened. 1 land transfer from 1981 that had always looked irregular now had the documentation to prove it was exactly that. These were not overnight victories. The legal process moved the way it always moves, slowly, with paperwork and patience. But they were moving. And for families who had spent decades being told there was nothing left to find, movement itself felt like oxygen. For Martha, the practical shift was quieter, but just as significant. The county initiative included a modest stipend for her role as primary archivist and historical consultant. It wasn't a fortune. It wasn't even close to comfortable by most people's standards. But it was enough. Enough to cover the house repairs that made the place safe to live in properly. Enough to keep the lights on without calculating whether she could afford both that and groceries. Enough to go to sleep at night without running numbers in her head until 3 in the morning. After years of that particular exhaustion, enough felt like abundance. The house itself was changing too, not restored to anything grand, just repaired. A new roof section where the old one had started giving way. The basement stairs reinforced so people could move safely between floors, windows that actually sealed against the weather. It was functional now, purposeful, alive in a way that abandoned things rarely get a second chance to be. Martha had not started over. She wanted to be clear about that in her own mind. Starting over implied that everything before had been erased, and she refused to let that be true. What she had built with Raymond, the years in that house on the street where the neighbor closed the blinds, the 23 years of keeping records straight, even the hard years of erosion and loss, none of that was erased. It was all still there. It had just led her here, to this house, to this table, to this work. But even as stability settled around her like something she had almost forgotten the feeling of, one thing remained unresolved, the one wound that no county initiative, no legal case, no archival stipend could touch. Somewhere out of state, Calvin Carter had heard things, fragments, secondhand accounts of what his mother had been doing in an abandoned house outside of town. Martha didn't know exactly what he had heard. She didn't know how he had heard it. But she knew her son. And she knew that silence from Calvin, after news like this, meant something was turning over inside him. Whether it would turn all the way, was the question she hadn't allowed herself to ask out loud. Not yet. It arrived on a Friday morning. No return address on the envelope. But Martha knew the handwriting before she even picked it up. She had seen it on birthday cards that arrived 3 days late, on a graduation program he had mailed instead of attending, on a single Christmas card 4 years ago that said, "Thinking of you," and nothing else. Calvin's handwriting had always looked like a man writing faster than he was thinking, urgent and slightly uneven, like someone trying to catch up to something they weren't sure they deserved. She set the envelope on the kitchen table, made herself a cup of coffee first, sat down, looked at it for a long moment. There was a version of Martha that wanted to leave it unopened, not out of anger, out of protection. She had rebuilt something fragile and real over these past months. But the stability she had earned one document, one family, one honest conversation at a time. And Calvin had a way, not out of cruelty, but out of his own unresolved damage, of arriving at the wrong moment with the right words, in the wrong order. She opened it anyway, because she was her father's daughter, and her father had never once walked away from something difficult, simply because it might hurt. The letter was 2 pages, handwritten, no crossings out, which told her he had written it more than once before he wrote this version. He had heard about the house, about the documents, about the families coming through. Someone from the County Historical Society had apparently mentioned her name in a regional newsletter, and a colleague of Calvin's had seen it and shown it to him. He wrote that he had sat with it for 3 weeks before picking up a pen. He didn't ask for forgiveness in the letter. Martha noticed that specifically. He didn't offer explanations for the years of distance. He didn't try to rewrite what had happened between them. He simply said that he had spent a long time being angry at a woman he didn't fully understand, and that reading about what she had done, what she had found, what she had quietly built in that broken-down house outside of town, had made him realize something he wasn't proud of being slow to see, that his mother had never once stopped being someone worth knowing. He had just stopped making the effort to know her. He asked if he could visit, not to fix everything, not to pretend the years between them hadn't happened, just to sit at the table and talk. Martha read the letter twice, then she folded it carefully, the way her father had folded his most important documents, and placed it inside the manila folder that had started everything. She didn't call Calvin that day. She didn't write back immediately. She sat with it, the way she had learned to sit with hard and valuable things, giving them the space they deserved before deciding what to do next. But that evening, as the light came through the repaired windows and fell across the organized stacks of her father's life work, Martha allowed herself something she had been quietly rationing for a very long time. Hope. Not the fragile, desperate kind she had carried into that motel room with $86, something steadier, something that felt less like a wish and more like a door, standing open, waiting. Without pressure, without deadline, just open. There is a moment in the life of certain people where everything they have ever lost and everything they have ever quietly carried suddenly makes sense. Not in a way that erases the pain, not in a way that rewrites the hard years, but in a way that reveals that nothing was ever wasted. Martha Jean Carter reached that moment on an ordinary morning. No cameras, no ceremony. Just early light coming through clean windows, falling across a kitchen table covered in organized folders, county maps, and the careful handwritten notes of a man who had believed, long before anyone else did, that the truth was worth preserving. Her father's handwriting was everywhere in that house now, on document margins, on index cards, on the backs of survey maps that had spent 40 years in the dark, and were now pinned to walls where people could study them, reference them, and use them to reclaim what had been quietly taken. He had not lived to see any of this, but she had, and she understood now, in a way she couldn't have understood before that Tuesday morning in October, that the eviction had not been the end of her story. It had been the door, the one she had to walk through to get to the room where she actually mattered. Calvin came on a Sunday. He stood at the front door for a moment before knocking, the way people do when they are rehearsing something they are afraid to get wrong. Martha opened the door before he could knock. She had heard his car in the gravel. They didn't embrace immediately. They stood in the doorway, looking at each other with the particular honesty of two people who have hurt each other, and have finally decided that the truth matters more than the armor. He came inside. She made coffee. They sat at the table. And they talked. Not about everything, not all at once. Some wounds need more than one conversation to properly breathe. But they talked. And that, after years of silence, was everything. Martha looked around that kitchen while Calvin spoke, at the maps on the wall, at the folders her father had filled with quiet purpose, at the windows that now let the light in properly, at her son, sitting across from her, choosing to be present. She had not become wealthy. She had not become famous. She had not been rescued by fortune or fantasy. She had simply followed the one thread available to her on the worst morning of her life and pulled it carefully, honestly, all the way to the truth. And the truth had given her back, not the life she had lost, but something more valuable than that, a life that finally felt finished, complete, purposeful. At 75 years old, Martha Jean Carter had not started over. She had finished something her father started. She had restored what erosion had quietly stolen. She had become necessary to people who needed exactly what she had spent a lifetime quietly becoming. And on that ordinary Sunday morning, with coffee cooling in 2 cups, and her son's voice filling a house that had been silent for 40 years, she understood something that no county officer with a clipboard, no closing blind, no motel mirror with a crack running through it had ever been able to take from her. She had always been someone worth knowing. The world had just needed time to catch up. If Martha's story moved something in you today, if you found yourself rooting for a woman the world had written off, then you already understand why these stories need to be told. Hit the like button right now. Not for us. For every person like Martha, who kept going quietly when nobody was watching. And if you believe that some people are not finished, they are just getting started, then subscribe. Because we find these stories, the ones about ordinary people who do extraordinary things with nothing but what they have left. You do not want to miss what is coming next. And if this story reminded you of someone, a mother, a grandmother, someone who carried everything quietly and never asked for recognition, drop their name in the comments below. Let the world see them. Even if just for a moment, they deserve that. We all do.